Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce my colleagues from the White House and the securities industry. On my right is John Koskinen, Chairman of the President's Council on the Year 2000 Conversion. To his right is Matt Fink, President of the Investment Company Institute. On my left is Dick Grasso, Chairman of the New York Stock Exchange. To his left is Frank Zarb, Chairman and CEO of the National Association of Securities Dealers. And to Frank's left is Mark Lakritz, President of the Securities Industry Association. As we enter the final quarter of 1999, more and more people are focusing on the implications.
Otherwise, some of us are going to be hypnotized into not paying attention to what you say. Thank you, sir.
Good suggestion.
That's called a contingency plan, a backup.
We felt it was important to give you a status report on the securities industry year 2000 preparedness. I'd like to begin by reporting that as of August 31st, 1999, all of the Securities and Exchange Commission's mission-critical and non-mission critical computer systems are remediated, tested, and are now year 2000 compliant. Investors, public companies, and many others, I believe, can feel assured that the SEC is prepared for the new millennium. This is a testament to the dedicated efforts of a number of SEC employees. In addition to making sure that our own computer systems are in order, the Commission has paid attention to the readiness of the industry. Since 1996, the SEC has undertaken a series of actions to ensure that investors are informed and protected. We have, among other things, conducted examinations. We've issued interpretive guidance. We've engaged in rulemaking, and we've brought enforcement actions. We've required extensive disclosure by broker-dealers, non-bank transfer agents, and investment advisors, as well as mutual funds. We made these disclosures available to the public on the Commission's website. For the smaller number of companies who have not met the disclosure requirements, we have initiated cases against them. And the Commission will continue to conduct intensive examinations to validate these disclosures. All the while, the industry has taken steps to address and to solve the problem. The firms and exchanges have been actively testing their systems and have developed detailed plans to address unforeseen issues. I want to commend the industry for being resolute in its commitment to thoroughly prepare itself for the millennium date change. Let me now turn to John Koskinen, and then we'll hear from Dick, Frank, Mark, and Matt on the state of their year 2000 remediation efforts. Thank you. John?
Thank you. I'm delighted. Thank you. I'm delighted to join you this morning on behalf of the President's Council on Year 2000 Conversion. As many of you know, as part of our effort to reach out from the federal government into the private sector and around the world, we've created 25 working groups, which are really partnerships with critical parts of the infrastructure. And one of our highest priorities has obviously been the financial institutions sector working group, including the industry you're hearing from here today. And we've been delighted with the progress made, particularly in the critical infrastructure in the United States. As many of you have heard me say before, we are increasingly confident that the basic infrastructure will hold, the power grids will operate, telecommunications, banking, air traffic will work as people expect them to do. And what we're here today is to talk about how financial institutions generally are prepared for this transition into the next millennium. And let me commend the Securities and Exchange Commission for the great leadership they've shown, both in increasing the amount of disclosure generally from companies to investors, but also in working in partnership with the industry to get us to the stage where we are today. The securities industry generally has been a leader in the United States in preparing for the year 2000, and as the chairman noted, has tested and retested its systems so as to be able to provide assurances to the investing public that in January they'll continue to be able to provide the same level of service that people have been expected to get in the past. This event is part of an ongoing series of events being held sector by sector to continue to update the public about the status of year 2000 readiness. It's our continued view that what people need is as much detailed information as we can provide. And as noted, the Securities Exchange Commission has been supporting that. The industry associations you're going to hear from here today have been providing information, and they've been encouraging all of their member companies to individually provide information to investors. And we think that if people have hard, real information, they'll be able to respond appropriately to the challenges as we move through the end of this year. So I'm delighted to be able to join this panel this morning and to participate in the questions and answers at a later time. And now happy to turn for the next comments to Richard Grasso, the Chairman and CEO of the New York Stock Exchange.
Thank you, John. Good morning, all. I'm very, very pleased that we're able, as an industry, to report to the media, but more importantly to 70 million Americans who are owners of equity securities, that the first trading day of the new millennium will be business as usual. The two principal markets under the leadership of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Securities Industry Association have conducted all of the necessary tests to make certain that investors will continue to participate in the deepest, most liquid, and most respected capital markets in the world. All of the NYSE's trading systems, from the introduction of orders to the post-trade clearance, comparison, and settlement, are Y2K compliant. We are, in this industry, very fortunate to have had the leadership of the SEC under the quarterbacking of Chairman Levitt and a coordinated effort from the Securities Industry Association. We have conducted all of the tests we believe necessary to make certain that investors will consider the first trading day of the new millennium to be just another trading day. As to the NYSE, we have the game plan in place that will make certain that all that is expected of our market will be provided. Our folks will quarterback a contingency team of communicators working with the other markets, working with the SIA and the Securities and Exchange Commission, so that I'm pleased to say that come the turn of the new millennium, the only issue investors will have is one of market selection and, if you will, participation, business as usual. From a regulatory point of view, all of our systems engaged to oversee broker-dealers who do business at the NYSE have been prepared for the date change, and thus we are in a position to say this morning to investors, please do not subscribe to the theories some have espoused. All right, we are going to be an industry that will conduct its business in a routine fashion in that first trading session, the year 2000. To my colleague, Frank Zarb.
Thank you, Dick. I can just echo what Dick Grasso has said. This preparation has gone ongoing since 1996. It's included testing, it's included examinations, and it is responsible for today's state of readiness. We obviously, our 5,500 members have worked together as probably the industry has for like no other time in its entire history, thanks to the SEC and to the SIA and helping us come together to make sure that it has worked in unity. We will conduct one more industry-wide test on Saturday, January 1st, and that will give us an opportunity to reaffirm that all that we think is well continues to be well. And we will also maintain a task force that will be connected to the other markets, prepared to respond to whatever may occur. And you never can tell when a vendor somewhere in the world has provided something of a disruption which we have to attend to. We'll be prepared to communicate and to move quickly to do what needs to be done. So the state of readiness is there, and the American investor should be very, very, very secure in their knowledge that we'll be prepared to operate business as usual on January 3rd, 2000. Mark Lackwitz, who has been responsible to a large extent to making sure that the industry has moved together, will be our next speaker.
Thanks very much, Frank. Good morning. I just want to focus on 3 points. One is that we've checked and rechecked all of our computers, and we've tested and retested all of our systems. And we think we're very well prepared for the conversion on January 1st, 2000. I might add that last summer, in July of 1998, we conducted the first beta test of our industry-wide test involving 28 firms and 13 exchanges and utilities, and that test went very well. So well that when we did the industry-wide test this past March and April, involving over 400 firms, all of the exchanges and all of the utilities, we simulated over 260,000 transactions, and only 2/100ths of 1% had Y2K problems, and they're being remediated as a result of the test. So we feel very confident as a result of our testing and retesting that we're prepared. In addition, we've set up contingency planning committees and plans, and we have the contingency plans being implemented as we speak. We have a business continuity committee that's implementing all these initiatives to assure that if anything untoward could possibly arise, we'll be on top of it. We're setting up a communications center, a coordinated communications center with the marketplaces, all the firms, all the exchanges, hooked into the regulators and that group to make sure that if anything occurs, we'll be on top of it right away. Secondly, we've spoken to investors about their concerns. We did a survey in June to see how concerned investors were about this issue. And we found that the overwhelming number of them, almost 90%, had a very high degree of confidence in the industry and in the markets that there wouldn't be no problems occurring as a result of the millennium change. Specifically, only a couple percent of the respondents to our survey indicated that they were going to do anything different with their money as a result of the Y2K issue. So having spoken with investors and having tested and retested our systems, we feel very confident going forward that we're in a position to serve investors well, to serve issuers well, and therefore to serve the public very well. And my last point is that I think that this effort, I want to thank Chairman Levitt, Dick Grasso, Frank Zara, my colleagues in this industry as well, for the unprecedented level of cooperation and coordination that has ensued as we've moved on this year 2000 issue. And we certainly hope that it serves as an example or maybe a template for moving forward on some of these other issues of great change to the securities industries as we move forward. And with that, let me turn it over to my colleague Matt Fink from the Investment Company Institute.
Thanks, Mark. I represent the mutual fund industry, which has devoted substantial efforts and resources to year 2000 issues. The industry, each fund has been testing its own systems and has also been involved in cross-industry compliance and information sharing. Mutual fund firms have significant resources and staff working on Y2K compliance. They're also keeping the fund's individual boards updated, are also educating 77 million mutual fund shareholders. Mutual fund compliance efforts span both the fund's own internal computer systems and systems of third parties that service the funds. The fund industry was involved in the street-wide Y2K testing that was coordinated earlier this year that Mark just referred to, that was run by the SIA. These tests were conducted to ensure that securities transactions clear and settle among all parties after January 1, 2000, and the mutual fund industry participated in that testing and completed the tests with very few problems. Now that the testing is completed, mutual fund companies have turned to establishing coordination and communication centers to ensure smooth business operations are maintained during the crossover. Now, no one can guarantee that we will be completely problem-free when the year 2000 arrives. But when considering the year 2000 issue in the context of the mutual fund industry, it's important to bear one additional factor in mind. Mutual fund investors and their assets are protected by the unique regulatory requirements of the Investment Company Act. That act, among other things, requires funds to price their shares and be ready to redeem those shares on every single business day. Other industries may face the risk of damaging customer relationships because of Y2K. Mutual funds face not only that risk, but also the risk that failure to comply will invoke very severe legal requirements and strictures under the Investment Company Act. The fund industry has been keeping the SEC informed of its progress. We've also been communicating with shareholders in written materials and websites. In fact, if you look at the websites of the 75 largest mutual fund groups, which have about 90% of total industry assets, you'll find that all 75 have very detailed websites communicating with their shareholders about Y2K. I'd like to join Mark and others and make special note of the tremendous level of cooperation and dialogue between the industry and the regulators. There has been a tremendous effort to share information between industry and government, and I think this will help keep the high level of confidence in the securities industry and the mutual fund industry, and I join Mark in hoping that it serves as a template for future cooperation.
The Commission will act against broker-dealers who may not be ready and don't voluntarily stay out of the way of investors. Are you prepared, therefore, to assure investors, including people who are newly on the internet every day and dipping in for the first time, that anybody who makes a trade on the first trading day of 2000, that will go through as normal?
Well, firms that are not ready by November 15th must cease doing new business, and they've got to wind up their operations by December the 1st. And for firms that fail to cooperate, the Division of Enforcement will file an injunctive action in district court. So I think investors can rest assured that their trades should be processed as efficiently as on any other normal day. Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment on the enormity of the merger announced today between Viacom and CBS. You're speaking to media folks, so.
I really have no comment on that.
You said that the SEC itself has remediated and tested its Y2K programs, but that doesn't necessarily mean implementation. Is the SEC's Y2K systems implemented? And if not, when will they be? And if they are, how do you define implementation?
Is Mike around?
Right over here.
Okay.
We have. I'm sorry, if you're not talking into one of those microphones, you're talking to the fellow who asked the question and nobody else.
All right. How would you like to handle it?
Walk up and pick
Yeah,
the
if you can
microphone.
grab a mic.
This is Mike Quinn, who works for us in terms of Y2K and will probably help me answer all the very technical questions.
The Commission has tested and has validated all of its systems. There are a small handful that are transitioning to production as we speak today. That will be completed by the end of September.
Yes.
What about overseas? Are you concerned? What do you think is the state of readiness overseas? And do you have concerns about that?
My guess is that the United States is clearly better positioned in terms of Y2K than other countries around the world. Certainly that's been my observation from discussions with my counterparts. The extent of their readiness is something that perhaps Dick or Frank would Mark would care to comment on.
Well, at least to the extent of those broker-dealer members of the New York Stock Exchange who are U.S. affiliates of non-U.S. broker-dealers, they would be at the same level of Y2K compliance as any U.S. intermediary. To the extent that there are non-NYSE member, or if you will, non-U.S. affiliates that would introduce business, it would be the responsibility of that introducing firm to either accept or reject the relationship if there are problems perceived. I think what we've done here in the United States, again, under the leadership of the Commission, is truly something extraordinary. We are today, with more than 3 months to go, in a position to say to investors, you are in a safe harbor here in the United States, and we are not prepared to let anything infect the level of readiness that we've created.
Just let me add to that, because I think it's probably the most significant question to be asked. The bulk of the broker-dealer business done in the United States from outside the United States, or with an outside the United States component, is done either through a U.S. member, the large U.S. firms that have facilities outside the U.S., or the non-U.S. securities firm that has a facility here. If they have a facility here, they are members of the NASD, members of the New York Stock Exchange, and therefore fall under our regulatory net. So the bulk of that community is being covered. To the extent that the element outside that group needs to be watched, we have some confidence that things are moving in the right direction, but we are ready with the right people and the right organization to handle anything that may come up after January 1st related to that small community.
Let me just add, if I could, that looking at sectors around the world, just as in the United States, banking and finance are ahead of everyone else, that situation holds true around the world. There's been a great cooperative effort between central banks and market regulators for the last couple of years, working around the world to ensure that both markets and investment companies are up and operating. So as we work with now 175 country national coordinators, all of them increasingly are confident about their financial sectors. They are more focused on basic infrastructure issues like power and telecommunications. So from the standpoint of the United States, the bulk of our transactions are with developed countries of the world who are doing very well, so that the risks internationally are primarily from operational risks, and they're in developing countries, and there's an decreasing number of those that we're really seriously concerned about in light of the effort going on. But at the basic level, this sector, I think, is in pretty good shape around the world.
Can I just add one point to that, which is we've been members of a group called the Global 2000 Coordinating Council for the last couple of years. And that's a group of international banks, international regulators, and self-regulators around the world in 47 countries that's trying to coordinate the efforts of all those countries to assure readiness for year 2000. There's also a group called Custody 2000 that's also testing the custody provisions. There's been a test run by SWIFT, another test run by CHIPS, the clearinghouse, the International Processing Clearinghouse for International Payments. And the Global 2000s group has been working with the Joint Year 2000 Council, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Union, and the International Year 2000 Coordination Center. So I think there's a huge amount of preparation that's going underway in that area as well.
On that same question, or that same issue, how good is the cooperation? I sense there's an awful lot of testing of individual systems and systems that work closely with other systems, but it seems as though there's an awful lot of systemic connection between different computer systems that isn't necessarily being tested in a comprehensive way. How are you folks dealing with that?
I think it's important to recognize, as Frank and I collectively represent the introducing financial intermediaries here in the United States, all that we have done on a coordinated basis leads us to be very confident that the U.S. marketplace is not in any risk of being non-compliant. If your question focuses on the introduction of business into the securities markets from outside of the U.S., from a non, if you will, testing intermediary, realize that that intermediary is going to have to introduce that business through an institution, an entity that is in the collective NASD, NYSE oversight. And so to the extent that there is that introduction of business, and to the extent that that attempt to introduce is on a non-compliant basis, it will not find its way into the U.S. marketplace.
Well, I guess I understand that, but at the same time, we keep hearing the word, it's a world marketplace now. And people don't just introduce business into the United States. We're also, also going out around the world, business people and investors here trying to make investments around the world. Are we in a position where systems outside the United States, because they may not necessarily be compliant, pose an economic risk, make it very difficult for the world economy to keep functioning at the rising level that it's been going at?
John, you've had more of a globality approach to this, but I would say in prefacing John's comments that it's a two-way flow of financial commerce. A U.S. investor reaching out is going to be reaching out through a Y2K compliant intermediary. I think that intermediary then has got to make a judgment as to whether an arena or a targeted investment is of a non-compliant nature, and you pose obviously a very difficult theoretical question. I would say to you that the financial intermediary here in the United States, whether it's a U.S. firm or a sub of a non-U.S. firm, has a responsibility to its customer. Our collective rules of knowing the customer and the responsibility of serving the customer to make certain that the customer doesn't find his or her way into a non-remediated marketplace. But John, you may have a broader focus.
Well, I think it's important to note what Mark said about the range of international organizations that have been working together in the financial institutions area. It includes central banks around the world, it includes market regulators around the world, and now an increasingly large number of international financial institutions all working together. And so in light of the testing that's gone on, and in light of where the bulk of our commerce is, we do not think that there's going to be a major impact on our economy, and probably not on the world's economy if you look at the major trading partners in the world today, because those are primarily developed countries that are doing very well. But we are concerned, and I don't want to gloss by the concern, that in some developing countries they're going to have major challenges as we move through the transition, and those will create some difficulties, particularly for people involved in transactions in those countries, but those will primarily be business transactions, less likely to be financial securities transactions. But there will be difficulties there, and the question that's hard to assess right now is how long those difficulties will exist, because in a lot of those countries they have basic infrastructure failures on a daily basis in terms of power or telecommunications. So the unknown is not that whether there'll be issues or not. There will be. The question will be what the impact of those will be. But stepping back from the standpoint not only of the U.S. economy but the global economy, we don't see any evidence that it's going to be a major negative impact on the world economy as we move into the year 2000.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, based on everything you've said, you still have the Y2K investor kit. So I have two questions. Everything seems to be okay, but yet you're saying people should use the kit. My questions are, what are the obligations of the individual investor regarding Y2K, and what, in your opinion, are the most important things the individual investor should be doing now to protect himself or herself for the year 2000?
Well, I think the individual investor has the obligation to keep him or herself informed about the issue, to be certain that the firms that they deal with are Y2K compliant, to ask those questions. The purpose of this session today was to convey to individual investors the fact that the securities industry and the companies that they deal with are going to be and are Y2K compliant. I think it's unrealistic to believe that there may not be some errors, some mistakes, but I am assured, and I think my colleagues bear that out, that those mistakes are minimal, but it is part of the process to see to it that the public understands that. I think the worst that we have to fear right now is public misperception, public fear. There are those that thrive on that kind of anxiety would do a great harm in terms of public understanding of the issue. The public should be reassured, and the kit that you speak of and our efforts in dealing with the public are intended to report on our progress and also to ask them to be as tuned into this and to ask as many questions as they possibly can about the people, to the people that they deal with in terms of investment decisions. Yes.
Chairman, Mr. Czar, you said that the industry is going to be in for one final test on January the 1st. I wonder if you could tell us some more about that. Are you going to have basically no holiday for most of your participating companies, or are you trying to get readouts of what's happening in other parts of the world as the year moves toward us? Or
For those who are involved in the testing network, they will be up and running and working on January 1st. So for those people, the holiday will be their joy in seeing that their systems work properly. Elise Walter, who is here, right here in the front row, is quarterbacking that program. We'll give you details if you want to see her later.
Yeah.
Will you raise concerns about Y2K preparedness when you meet with Japanese head financial regulator this week?
I wasn't aware that I was with them, but certainly if I am, the subject will certainly, when and if I meet with them, the subject will certainly come up.
What's your opinion of Japanese preparedness at this point? There's still a couple % of firms that have not met all of the requirements set out by the lead agencies there. How do you view that?
I'm not prepared to comment on the level of preparedness of a particular country. Perhaps some of my colleagues. Yes.
Sir, I wanted to ask Mr. Fink a question about mutual funds. According to the SEC's fact sheet, as of June, which is just a little over a month ago, 90% of the funds were complete or nearly complete, which means 10% of the funds were not. Isn't that a cause for concern for the average investor?
No, I think there's still 6 months remaining, and I haven't gone through each of those, but I think 90% is pretty good 6 months out.
3 months out.
3 months out.
Yes.
I have a couple questions, big picture questions for Mr. Koskinen. Before we get to year 2000, on January 1, there are a couple of dates on the horizon that I think will probably be tests of one kind or another. What concerns do you have, first of all, about this Thursday, 9/9/99? And from the standpoint of the federal government, October 1 is fiscal year 2000. Any particular concerns on either one of those issues?
We and a lot of other people will monitor what happens on Thursday, September 9th, but do not have any real concerns that anything significant will happen for those who aren't following the bouncing ball. Some non-standard programming practices included using a series of 9s to end the program operation. So the theory and concern was 9/9/99 would be a series of 9s. We don't think it's going to be a big problem. First, a lot of people who programmed September 9th programmed at 09/09/99. Secondly, it was not a standard practice. I was at a community conversation last week in Chicago, and the city of Chicago noted they had found no problem with that date through their systems. Third thing is everybody's been aware of that date as a testing date and are testing and have tested their systems against it. And finally, I'm told by the experts that finding a series of 9s in a computer code is relatively straightforward as opposed to finding out where date processing is going on. So on the one hand, I think it'll be reassuring if not much happens that you can in fact deal with a Y2K-like problem just as we dealt with the global positioning system satellite rollover effectively. On the other hand, I don't think we should become too overconfident because, as I say, it's a much smaller problem, I think, than the more generic and standard Y2K problem. With regard to the federal government's October 1 fiscal year, we also don't expect much of a problem or any problem there. You may recall 46 states rolled into fiscal year 2000 on July 1 of this year, and all of them reported they were able to do that without difficulty. There were a few glitches. We were all stressing to you there will probably be glitches everywhere, but they were minor and modest, and nobody had a problem with them. And so similarly, we do not expect that the federal government, when it starts to manage its systems in the fiscal year 2000 in October, will have any significant or noticeable problems.
Mr. Chairman, how many firms have notified the SEC that they will need until November 15th? If I recall, August 31st was an initial deadline, and if firms weren't ready, they were supposed to notify you that they would like to have until the 15th. How many firms have you heard from?
We've received four notifications from broker-dealers and one from non-bank transfer agents. We'll monitor their efforts as they work to make the November 15th deadline specified in the rule.
Chairman, Mr. Grasso, Mr. Zarb have been talking about making wide-ranging changes in their markets in terms of after-hours trading and demutualization. There has been talk that that was on a fast track. Did you ask them to put that off until after Y2K? And if the industry is prepared for Y2K, why not go ahead on a faster pace with after-hours trading and those kinds of things?
No, I didn't request a timetable of any kind. What I did ask for was a measure of coordination to be certain that the public investors were not disadvantaged in any way, that these changes were so significant that we could not afford to have mistakes injure the public investor. But I'm working very closely with Dick and with Frank and with the industry, for that matter, to see to it that as those changes take place, public investors' interests come ahead of all others.
Just a quick question. Mr. Koskinen and Chairman Levitt have both mentioned a little bit that some minor problems might be expected. Could you talk a little bit about the contingency plans that are kind of in place? What kind of things are the contingency plans planning for, essentially? And are they industry-wide, or are they based in part, or are they generated specifically by the firms themselves? Are they covering overall?
Sure. We had a contingency planning committee that was headed up by Jerry Corrigan of Goldman Sachs and John Hyman, formerly of Merrill Lynch. And they put together a pretty extensive document, a contingency plan document that outlined a variety of scenarios ranging from fairly generalized kinds of contingencies to very specific markets or country problems. And they specifically then identified a series of best practices for all the firms to implement in their own firms to assure that if any of these kinds of problems would arise, the firms and the industry would be prepared to address those. We then established to implement these recommendations a business continuity group that is, in fact, in the process of implementing all these recommendations of the contingency planning committee to assure that each firm is prepared and that the industry is prepared. In addition, we've got this coordinated communications center that's going to come up in the middle of December and operate from the middle of December through the middle of January, to assure that there is a coordinated information sharing process real time to address any and all contingencies that might arise.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Gorgio from the First Television. Wondering if we can ask you a quick question about the story.